Welcome to the London Gritty Chronicles. The year is 1346. Imagine standing on a high stone wall, looking out at the horizon. Behind you, the sound of a bustling city, the smell of roasting meat, the shouting of merchants in Italian, Greek, and Armenian. The sea breeze carries the salt of the Black Sea. In front of you, endless silence. The dusty plains of the Crimean Peninsula stretch out for miles. But the silence is deceptive. Out there, in the dust, an army is waiting. And within that army, something else is waiting. Something invisible. Something that will change the history of the world forever. We are standing on the walls of Caffa. Today, we begin a deep investigation into one of the most controversial moments in human history. The story goes like this. A Mongol army besieging a Christian city uses catapults to throw infected dead bodies over the walls. The disease spreads, the ships flee, and the Black Death enters Europe. It is a terrifying image. But is it true? Historians dispute this account. Scientists question the biology. And today, we are going to act as detectives. We will look at the evidence. We will learn the language of uncertainty. And we will find out what likely happened at the siege of Caffa. To understand the tragedy, we must first understand the prize. Why was an entire Mongol army sitting outside this city? Look at the map. In the 14th century, the world was connected by a thin, fragile line called the Silk Road. Goods traveled from China and India across the steppes of Asia to the shores of the Black Sea. This was the bottleneck of the world's economy. If you controlled the Black Sea, you controlled the flow of silk, spices, and unfortunately, the flow of slaves. Caffa, known today as Feodosia, was the jewel of this trade. But it was not a Mongol city. It belonged to the Republic of Genoa. Genoa is a city in Italy. But in the 1300s, the Genoese were masters of the sea. They were tough, aggressive businessmen. They negotiated a deal with the Mongol rulers, the Golden Horde, to build a trading station on the Crimean coast. Think of Caffa as a colony. A colony is a settlement or territory under the control of a distant country. For decades, this arrangement worked. The Mongols controlled the land. The Genoese controlled the sea. Everyone made money. The city of Caffa grew rich. Travelers described it as a massive, fortified city. It had 2 rings of walls. Inside, it was a mix of cultures. You would hear a dozen languages spoken in the market square. But wealth brings envy, and proximity brings conflict. Proximity means nearness in space or time. When 2 powerful groups live in close proximity, tension is inevitable. The tension exploded not in Caffa, but in a nearby town called Tana. In 1343, a street fight broke out between Italians and Muslims in the market of Tana. It seems like a small incident, a personal dispute, but in history, small sparks often ignite massive fires. During the fight, a Genoese merchant killed a Tatar. The Tatars were the people ruled by the Mongol Khans. The local Mongol authorities were furious. They tried to arrest the Italians. The Italians, being proud and perhaps foolish, fled to their ships and sailed to Caffa for protection. This was the excuse the Mongol ruler was waiting for. His name was Janibeg. Janibeg was the Khan of the Golden Horde. He was a powerful, ambitious leader. He had converted to Islam, and he saw the Christian Italians not just as trading partners, but as arrogant intruders. When the fugitives from Tana arrived in Caffa, Yani Beg demanded they be handed over. The Genoese in Caffa refused. They locked the gates. They manned the towers. They prepared for a siege. Listen to that word, siege. In history, a siege is a military operation where enemy forces surround a town or building, cutting off essential supplies, with the aim of compelling the surrender of those inside. To lay siege is the action. To break a siege is to escape or defeat the surrounding army. Yani Beg gathered his army. The Golden Horde was legendary. Their cavalry could ride for days without rest. Their archers could hit a target from hundreds of meters away. They surrounded Caffa. But Caffa had an advantage: the sea. The Mongols were masters of the land. They had horses, wagons, and catapults. But they did not have a strong navy. As long as the Genoese ships could sail in and out of the harbor, the city could not be starved. Food, water, and weapons arrived from Italy. The siege dragged on. Months turned into years. Specifically, the conflict started in 1343, paused, and then resumed with full intensity in 1345. It was a stalemate. A stalemate is a situation in which neither side in an argument or contest can make progress. Yani Beg was frustrated. His army was camped on the dry plains outside the walls. Camp life in the 14th century was difficult. Sanitation was poor. Food was sometimes scarce. But inside the city, the Genoese were confident. They felt safe behind their high stone walls. They believed they could outlast the barbarians. They were wrong. They were looking at the Mongol army and seeing only men with swords. They did not see the invisible passenger that was traveling with the Silk Road caravans. It was moving slowly from the east. In 1346, rumors began to reach the Crimea. Travelers spoke of a terrible pestilence in the east. Pestilence is an old word for a fatal epidemic disease. They said entire cities in China and India were empty. They said birds fell dead from the sky. The Genoese in Caffa likely dismissed these stories. Rumors were common. They were focused on the visible threat, Yani Beg's army. But the biology of the world was about to collide with the politics of the world. While Yani Beg stared at the walls of Caffa, plotting how to break them, his own army was beginning to feel sick. Not just tired, not just hungry. Men were developing fevers. Strange swellings appeared on their bodies. The stalemate was about to break, but not by military force. The narrative we are building here is one of hubris. Hubris is excessive pride or self-confidence. The Genoese had hubris because of their walls. Yani Beg had hubris because of his numbers. Both sides believed they were in control. But in narrative nonfiction and in history, control is often an illusion. We are setting the stage for a forensic examination. Forensic means relating to the application of scientific methods to investigate a crime or mystery. The crime scene is Caffa. The weapon is disputed. As we move to the next part, I want you to pay attention to how we describe sources. We will introduce a man named Gabriele de Musi. He is the reason we know this story, but he is also the reason we doubt it. English learners, notice how we use the phrase, the reason we. followed by a verb. He is the reason we doubt it. This is the reason we study history. This structure connects a cause, the person, to an effect, our doubt. The sun is setting on Caffa in late 1345. The Genoese sentries walk the walls, watching the Mongol campfires flickering in the distance. They notice something strange. There are fewer fires tonight. There is less shouting from the enemy lines. Something is happening in the camp of the Golden Horde. The silence is returning, but this time it is the silence of the grave. Janibek is losing his army, but he has one final, desperate idea, an idea that will be written down in horror, translated into dozens of languages, and debated for 700 years. The atmosphere is heavy. The air is still. The wind is about to shift. The silence outside the walls of Caffa was not peace. It was exhaustion. In the camp of the Golden Horde, the soldiers were no longer fighting the Genoese. They were fighting their own bodies. It started with a headache, then a shivering fever. Soon painful swellings appeared in the groin or under the armpits. These swellings were called buboes. They were black, filled with blood and pus. Within days, sometimes hours, the strongest warriors of the steppe were dead. The army of Janibek was dissolving. A dissolving army means it was falling apart, losing its structure and discipline. Imagine the chaos. Thousands of men, horses, and wagons cramped together. There is no modern medicine, no understanding of germs, only fear. Janibek, the Khan, watched his power crumble. He had come to conquer a city. Now he was the one being conquered by nature. This brings us to the most famous and most debated moment of the siege. According to one specific historical account, Janibek made a decision born of pure rage. He ordered his men to gather the corpses of the plague victims. A corpse is a dead human body. It is a formal, somewhat clinical word. He ordered these corpses to be loaded onto his siege engines. These were likely trebuchets, massive wooden machines designed to throw heavy stones to break walls. But today, they would not throw stones. The account describes a scene of nightmarish proportions. The counterweights dropped, the wooden arms swung up, and the dead bodies were hurled over the walls, flying through the air, and crashing into the city of Caffa. Hurled is a strong verb. It means to throw something with great force. The primary source for this story is a man named Gabriele de Mussi. Listen to his name, Gabriele de Mussi. He was a notary from the Italian city of Piacenza. A notary is a person authorized to perform legal formalities, like witnessing signatures. In history, they were often the record keepers. De Mussi wrote a vivid description of this event in his work, History of the Disease. He wrote, "Mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee from them, although they dumped as many as they could in the sea." He describes the smell, the panic, the water turning foul. He frames this as a deliberate act of biological warfare. Biological warfare is the use of toxins or infectious agents, such as bacteria or viruses, to kill or incapacitate humans, animals, or plants as an act of war. If de Mussi is correct, Janibek committed one of the first recorded acts of biological terror in history. He turned his own dead soldiers into weapons. But here we must pause. we must apply our critical reading skills. When you read history, you must always ask, is the narrator reliable? A reliable narrator is one you can trust to tell the truth. An unreliable narrator might be biased, confused, or lying. Let's look at the language of uncertainty. Historians dispute de Mussi's account. To dispute means to argue against something or question its truth. Why do they dispute it? First, look at the logistics. A trebuchet is a complex machine. Loading a limp, infected human body is difficult. The body would likely break apart in the air. Second, look at the geography. De Mussi was in Piacenza, Italy, when he wrote this. He was not in Caffa. Evidence suggests he was writing based on stories he heard from sailors, not what he saw with his own eyes. Notice that phrase, evidence suggests. This is a hedging phrase. It allows you to make a claim without being 100% certain. You can also say, it is likely that, or it appears that. So, did the mountains of corpses actually fly over the walls? Maybe a few did. Perhaps it was a symbolic gesture of hatred. But modern scientists argue that the catapults were not necessary to spread the disease. Rats do not need catapults. Fleas do not need passports. The Mongols and the Genoese had been fighting for years. They likely had contact. Spies, deserters, rats running through the drain pipes. The bacteria, Yersinia pestis, is relentless. Relentless means unceasingly intense. It does not stop. Whether the bodies flew over the walls or not, the result was the same. The air in Caffa changed. The Genoese, once safe behind their stone shield, began to fall ill. The same symptoms appeared: the fever, the buboes, the swift death. Panic swept through the streets of the trading post. The rigid social structure of the colony broke down. Merchants stopped trading. Soldiers stopped guarding. Priests stopped praying, or prayed harder, but received no answer. The biology to society mirror was in full effect. The internal collapse of the human body, organs failing, led to the external collapse of the city, laws failing. The Genoese realized they were trapped. The walls that kept the Mongols out were now keeping the disease in. They looked to the harbor. The sea was their lifeline. It was their escape route. Dozens of galleys, large merchant ships powered by sails and oars, sat in the docks. The captains made a fateful decision. Fateful means having far-reaching and often disastrous consequences. They would abandon Caffa. They would load their gold, their silks, and their families, and they would sail home to Italy. They believed they could outrun the plague. They believed that if they left the physical place of Caffa, they would leave the sickness behind. They did not understand the incubation period. The incubation period is the time between exposure to an infection and the appearance of the first symptoms. A person can look healthy, but carry death in their blood. As the Genoese sailors scrambled onto their ships, pushing off from the infected shore, they felt a sense of relief. The wind filled their sails. The Black Sea opened up before them. They were escaping hell, but they were bringing hell with them. In the bowels of the ships, among the sacks of grain and spices, the rats were hiding. And on the rats were the fleas. And inside the men, the bacteria was already multiplying. These ships were not refugees. They were floating biological bombs, and they were headed straight for the heart of Europe. This moment, the departure of the ships, is the true turning point of the Middle Ages. If Janibek had simply conquered the city and killed everyone, the plague might have stayed local for a while longer. But the panic caused the flight, and the flight caused the spread. The mechanism of global catastrophe was a wooden ship sailing on a calm sea. As the galleys disappear over the horizon, we must ask ourselves, where did they go first? And what happened when they arrived? The answer lies in the beautiful, sunny port of Messina, Sicily. But before we get there, we need to analyze the text of De Mussi more closely in the next part. We need to see how a story becomes a legend, and how a legend becomes a fact. Get ready to critically evaluate the difference between primary sources and hearsay. We are now floating on the Black Sea. The year is still 1346, or perhaps early 1347. The Genoese galleys are cutting through the waves. The sailors are looking back at the receding coastline of Crimea. They are relieved. Receding means moving back or further away from a previous position. But let's pause the camera right here. Let's freeze the frame on these ships. And let's go back to the man who told us the story of the flying corpses, Gabriele de Mussi. As detectives of history, we need to ask, where was he standing? Was he on the walls of Caffa? Was he on one of these ships? The answer is no. Gabriele de Mussi was sitting comfortably in his office in Piacenza, a city in northern Italy. He was thousands of miles away from the siege. This makes him a secondary source for the events at Caffa, even though he lived at the same time. A primary source is a document or physical object which was written or created during the time under study. A secondary source interprets and analyzes primary sources. De Mussi was writing down what he heard. In legal English, we call this hearsay. Hearsay is information received from other people that one cannot adequately substantiate. It is a rumor. So, when De Mussi wrote about mountains of dead flying through the air, was he reporting a fact? Or was he reporting a terrifying story told by a traumatized sailor in a tavern? Historians debate this vigorously. Vigorously means with great effort and energy. Why do they doubt him? Let's look at the biology. The Black Death was likely caused by Yersinia pestis. This bacteria has two main forms of transmission. One is bubonic. This requires a flea bite. The flea drinks the blood of an infected rat. The bacteria blocks the flea's gut, and the starving flea bites a human, regurgitating the bacteria into the wound. Regurgitating means bringing swallowed food up again to the mouth. It is a disgusting but precise word. The second form is pneumonic. This is when the bacteria infects the lungs. You cough and droplets fly into the air. If someone breathes them in, they die. Now consider the catapults. Dead bodies do not breathe. They do not cough. So, they cannot spread pneumonic plague easily. Dead bodies also cool down very fast. Fleas are attracted to body heat. When a rat or a human dies, the fleas leave the cold body almost immediately to find a warm host. So, if the Mongols threw dead bodies, the fleas would likely have already jumped off. Scientific evidence suggests that throwing corpses would not have been a very effective way to start an epidemic. However, it is plausible that the Mongols threw the bodies to cause fear and smell. Plausible means seeming reasonable or probable. But the primary cause of the infection inside Caffa was likely much simpler. Rats. Rats are excellent climbers. They can squeeze through tiny holes. They can run along ropes. While the armies were staring at each other, the rats were ignoring the borders. They were moving from the Mongol camp, through the drainage ditches, and into the Genoese food stores. The accidental twist here is that the Genoese were so focused on the visible war, the catapults, the arrows, that they missed the invisible invasion. The rats brought the fleas bit the Genoese. So, Dumussi's story of the flying bodies might be a dramatic exaggeration. But why does it matter? It matters because it tells us how people felt. They felt like they were under attack by something demonic. They couldn't understand germs, so they blamed the enemy's malice. Malice is the intention or desire to do evil. Now, let's return to the ships. The galleys are sailing toward Constantinople. This was the greatest city in the world at the time, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Genoese ships needed supplies. They needed water. They sailed into the Golden Horde, the magnificent harbor of Constantinople. They docked. They unloaded some goods. They likely hugged their friends and business partners. And then the incubation period ended. The sailors began to collapse on the docks. The residents of Constantinople watched in horror as the visitors turned black and died. The Emperor of Byzantium, John VI Cantacuzene, wrote his own account. He did not talk about catapults. He talked about a scythe that cut down the living. A scythe is a tool with a long, curved blade used for cutting crops. It is the symbol of the Grim Reaper, or death. The biology to society mirror cracked. Panic erupted in Constantinople. The Genoese captains, realizing they were not welcome and terrified of the sickness themselves, ordered the ships to leave. "Cast off!" they would shout. To cast off means to untie a boat and leave the shore. They were running again, but they had already left the package behind. Constantinople was infected. The plague began to tear through the Byzantine Empire. The ships sailed on, westward, toward Italy, toward home. They were carrying a cargo more deadly than any weapon Janibeg could have invented. And as they sailed, the viral load on the ships increased. Viral load is a modern term for the amount of virus in an infected person's blood. In this historical context, we can use it metaphorically to describe the intensity of the disease on the ships. Men were dying in the rowing benches. Bodies were thrown overboard, floating in the wake of the ships. The sharks followed the galleys. And the rats? The rats were still hiding in the grain sacks, waiting for the next port. The next port was Messina on the island of Sicily. It was October 1347. The people of Messina saw the familiar sails of the Genoese fleet. They rushed to the harbor. They expected silk, spices, and news from the east. They were happy. English learners, listen to this contrast. They were expecting profit. They received perdition. Perdition is a state of eternal punishment and damnation. The ships docked, the ropes were tied, the gangplanks were lowered. And the history of Europe ended. The history of the plague began. We will step onto the docks of Messina. We will see the exact moment the quarantine failed. before it even started. We will learn how to describe chaos using the passive voice. Mistakes were made. And we will witness the first true societal collapse of the Western world. The emotional wave is crashing down now. The date is October 1347. The setting is the harbor of Messina on the island of Sicily. In the history of the world, there are certain days that act as hinges. The door of history swings shut on one era and opens onto another. October 1347 was one of those hinges. The citizens of Messina were looking out at the strait. They saw 12 galleys approaching. They recognized the flags. These were Genoese ships. They were the masters of the Black Sea trade. To the Sicilians, these ships meant commerce, news, and opportunity. They did not know that they were looking at their own executioners. We have a primary source for this moment, a chronicler named Michael of Piazza. Unlike de Mussi, Michael of Piazza was a Franciscan friar living in Sicily. His account feels more intimate, more grounded in the immediate horror on the docks. He wrote, 12 Genoese galleys arrived at the harbor of Messina, carrying such a deadly disease that anyone who only spoke to them was seized by a mortal illness. Notice the phrase, seized by. In English, to be seized usually means to be grabbed suddenly by a person or a force. You can be seized by the police. You can be seized by panic. Here, they were seized by death. The ships docked. The ropes were thrown to the men on the pier. The Genoese sailors stumbled onto dry land. But something was wrong. These were not the proud, loud merchants of usual times. They were ghosts. Michael of Piazza describes them vividly. He says they had sickness clinging to their very bones. They were delirious. They were covered in black boils. Delirious describes a disturbed state of mind characterized by restlessness, illusions, and incoherence of thought and speech. The Messinians realized, almost immediately, that a terrible mistake had been made. Fear is a fast traveler. The harbor masters tried to stop the sailors. They tried to push the ships back, but the connection had already been made. This is the biology to society mirror at its most tragic. While the humans were arguing on the docks, shouting, pushing, negotiating, the invisible biological transaction was taking place. The rats. While the ships were tied to the dock, the ship rats ran down the ropes. They scurried into the shadows of the Messinian port. Scurried is a verb used to describe the quick, shuffling movement of a small animal. These rats carried the infected fleas. They met the local Sicilian rats. The fleas jumped hosts. The transfer was complete. Within days, the people of Messina began to die. The reaction was swift and brutal. The city officials ordered the Genoese ships to be expelled. To expel means to force someone to leave a place, especially a country or school. The galleys were forced back out to sea. But where could they go? They were floating pariahs. A pariah is an outcast, someone who is rejected by a community. These ships drifted along the coast of Italy, looking for anywhere to land. Every time they approached a port, the news had traveled ahead of them. They were greeted with arrows and fire. But for Messina, it was too late. The infection moved from the port into the city. Families panicked. They did what humans always do in times of crisis. They fled. They packed their belongings and ran into the countryside. They ran to the vineyards and the castles of the nobility. But remember the lesson from Part 2. You cannot outrun biology. By fleeing the city, the Messenians became the vehicles of the plague. They carried the fleas and the bacteria into the heart of Sicily. This brings us to a crucial English concept: cause and effect language. English learners, listen for these connectors. Consequently, as a result, thus. The ships arrived. Consequently, the rats disembarked. The citizens fled. As a result, the disease spread to the villages. The bacteria entered the bloodstream. Thus, the victim died within 3 days. Using these words makes your English sound more academic and structured. Back in Sicily, the social order was collapsing. Michael of Piazza tells us that fathers abandoned sons, wives abandoned husbands. The fear of contagion was stronger than the bond of love. Contagion is the communication of disease from one person to another by close contact. People began to believe this was the end of the world, the apocalypse. They looked for someone to blame. Since they did not understand bacteria, they blamed God's anger, or they blamed the stars, or, tragically, they blamed outsiders. The emotional wave shifts from the dread of the arrival to the chaos of the spread. We are seeing the disintegration of medieval society. Disintegration is the process of losing cohesion or strength, breaking into small parts. The church, the government, the family unit, all the structures that held society together were dissolving under the pressure of the pestilence. But what happened to the ships, the 12 galleys? They scattered. Scattered means threw in various random directions. Some went to Genoa. Some went to Marseille in France. Some drifted until everyone on board was dead, becoming ghost ships that floated aimlessly on the Mediterranean. Each time one of these ships touched land, a new epicenter was created. An epicenter is the point on the Earth's surface directly above an earthquake. We use it metaphorically to mean the center of a crisis. By early 1348, the Black Death had hit Pisa, Genoa, and Venice. It was moving north. It was moving fast. It was about to meet a civilization that was already weak. Europe in the 1340s was not a paradise. It was overpopulated. The weather had been bad. There was famine. The population was malnourished. Malnourished means suffering from a lack of proper nutrition. They were the perfect fuel for the fire. We will travel north to the great city of Florence. We will meet one of the greatest writers of the Italian Renaissance, Giovanni Boccaccio. He will be our guide through the hellscape of a dying city. He will teach us how to describe the breakdown of law and human decency. And we will look at the strange, terrifying doctors who tried to fight an enemy they couldn't see. The story is about to move from the ships to the streets. We have left the sea. We are now walking the cobblestone streets of Florence. Florence, the city of flowers, the birthplace of the Renaissance. But in the spring of 1348, there were no flowers. There was only the stench of death. To stench is a strong, very unpleasant smell. Florence was one of the largest and richest cities in Europe. It was a banking powerhouse. It had high walls, paved streets, and a sophisticated government. It was the New York City of the Middle Ages, and it was about to be destroyed. Our guide for this part of the journey is Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio was an Italian writer and poet. He survived the plague in Florence and wrote a masterpiece called The Decameron. The Decameron opens with a terrifyingly accurate description of the plague's arrival. He acts as our camera. He writes that the disease did not behave like it did in the East. In the East, he heard it caused nosebleeds. In Florence, it began with tumors in the groin or armpits. These tumors grew to the size of an apple or an egg. The people called them gavoccioli. After the tumors, black spots appeared on the arms and thighs. Boccaccio wrote, "These spots were a certain sign of death." But Boccaccio's true value to us is not just medical. It is sociological. He describes how the psychology of the city shattered. He identified 3 types of reactions among the citizens. English learners, look for the classification structure here. Reaction. Type 1, the isolators. Some people believed that if they lived moderately and avoided all excess, they would be safe. They locked themselves in their houses. They ate only the finest food and drank the best wine. They refused to listen to the news. They tried to create a bubble of normalcy. Reaction. Type 2, the denialists. Others went the opposite way. They believed death was inevitable, so they might as well enjoy life. Inevitable means certain to happen, unavoidable. They drank heavily. They sang in the streets. They broke into the empty houses of the rich and threw parties. They laughed at the plague. Reaction type 3, the avoiders. This was the majority. They walked around carrying flowers, scented herbs, or spices. They held them to their noses. Why? Because of the miasma theory. In 1348, nobody knew what a germ was. Nobody knew what a virus was. The leading scientific theory was miasma. Miasma means bad air. Doctors believed the air itself had become poisonous, perhaps due to an earthquake releasing gases from the earth, or a planetary alignment. They believed that if you smelled something sweet, you could block the bad air. This is why you see the famous images of plague doctors. Let's focus on the plague doctor for a moment. The long beak? It wasn't for fashion. It was a primitive gas mask. It was stuffed with herbs and spices to filter the miasma. The long coat? It was coated in wax to let fluids slide off. The cane? It was used to examine patients without touching them. These doctors were brave, but they were tragically wrong. The danger wasn't in the smell. It wasn't in the air, mostly. It was in the fleas on the rats scurrying around their boots. Boccaccio gives us one more devastating detail. He writes about the breakdown of human connection. One citizen avoided another. Brothers abandoned brothers. And oftentimes, wives abandoned husbands. And the most shocking line of all, fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children, as though they did not belong to them. Imagine the fear required to break the bond between a mother and her child. The city authorities tried to maintain order. They dug trenches. Trenches are long, narrow ditches. They stopped using individual graves. They dug long pits and stacked the bodies in layers like lasagna, as one chronicler grimly described. The signature differentiator of our story is to look at the system. The banking system of Florence collapsed because there was no one to sign the ledgers. The wool trade stopped because there were no workers to wash the wool. The city went silent. But the plague didn't stay in the cities. It moved into the countryside of Tuscany. It moved into the villages of England. It moved into the snows of Scandinavia. By the end of 1350, the map of Europe had been redrawn, not by borders, but by emptiness. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree that between 30% and 60% of the European population died. Think about that number. 1 in 2 people. Look at your hand. You have 5 fingers. Imagine losing 2 or 3 of them. That is the scale of the loss. But nature abhors a vacuum. Abhors means to regard with disgust and hatred. A vacuum is an empty space. When 50% of the people disappear, the world changes in unexpected ways. This brings us to the after of our story. The accidental twist is that this horror, this absolute nightmare, created the modern world. How? How can death create life? It starts with a simple economic concept: supply and demand. We will travel to England. We will look at the peasants in the fields. We will see how the Black Death suddenly made the poorest people in society the most valuable. We will learn the language of economics: labor shortage, wages, bargaining power. And we will see the feudal lords panic as their power begins to slip away. The disease killed the people, but it might have saved the survivors. We cross the English Channel. The year is 1349. The mist hangs low over the green fields of England. Usually this time of year, the fields would be full of noise. Men cutting wheat, women gathering bundles, children chasing birds away. But this year, the fields are quiet. The wheat is standing tall, but it is rotting. The apples are falling from the trees, turning brown in the grass. Why? Because there is no one left to harvest them. We are entering the economic aftermath of the tragedy. We saw the horror. In Part 6, we see the transformation. To understand this, you need to understand the status quo before the plague. Status quo is a Latin phrase used in English to mean the existing state of affairs, the way things are right now. Before 1348, England was a feudal society. At the top were the lords. They owned the land. At the bottom were the serfs, or peasants. A serf was a worker who was bound to the land. He could not leave. He had to work for the lord for free, in exchange for a small patch of dirt to grow his own food. It was a trap. The lords held all the cards. To hold all the cards is an idiom, meaning to be in a position of power or control. Labor was cheap because there were too many people. If one peasant died, another was waiting to take his place. But then the ships arrived in Weymouth. The rats came ashore, and the population crashed. Suddenly, the math changed. Imagine a lord. Let's call him Lord Robert. Lord Robert survives the plague. He walks out of his castle. He looks at his massive fields. He wants to sell his grain to London to make money. But he sees only 3 peasants left alive in the village. He rides his horse down to them. He orders them to get to work. "Harvest my wheat," he shouts. In the old days, the peasants would have bowed and obeyed. They would have been terrified. But today, the peasants look at each other. They look at the empty village houses. They look back at Lord Robert. And they do something revolutionary. They say, no. Or rather, they say, pay us more. This is the birth of leverage. Leverage is the power to influence a person or situation to achieve a particular outcome. The peasants realized they were a scarce resource. Scarce means insufficient for the demand, rare. Lord Robert is furious. He is panic-stricken. If the wheat is not harvested, he goes bankrupt. So he reaches into his purse. He offers them double the usual wage. The peasants accept. They have won. This scene played out across thousands of villages in Europe. The balance of power shifted from the capital, land, to the labor, people. Wages skyrocketed. Skyrocketed means increased very rapidly. Prices for food dropped because there were fewer mouths to feed. For the survivors, specifically the poor survivors, life actually got better. They ate more meat. They wore better clothes. They moved into the empty houses of the rich. Historians sometimes call this the golden age of the laborer. It is a dark irony. Irony is a state of affairs that seems deliberately contrary to what one expects. The worst disaster in history led to the greatest improvement in living standards for the working class. But the powerful do not give up power easily. The King of England, Edward III, and his government were terrified by this social change. They saw the peasants wearing fancy clothes. They saw them demanding high wages. They felt the world was turning upside down. So they tried to stop it with a law. In 1351, they passed the Statute of Laborers. A statute is a written law passed by a legislative body. This law made it illegal to pay a peasant more than he earned before the plague. It demanded that wages remain frozen at 1346 levels. It also made it illegal for a peasant to refuse work. The government tried to pause the economy. They tried to force the status quo back into existence. Did it work? No. Economic forces are like the tide. You cannot stop them with a piece of paper. Lords had to ignore the law and pay under the table, or their crops would rot. The black market for labor exploded. But the law did create anger. Resentment began to build. The peasants knew their worth, but the law treated them like criminals. This tension would bubble under the surface for a few decades until it exploded in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But the spark was lit here, in the ashes of the Black Death. Let's step back and look at the biology to society mirror again. The biological simplification of the population, fewer people, led to the social complication of the economy, more bargaining power. The feudal system was dying. The old world of I command, you obey was being replaced by the modern world of I pay, you work. This is the beginning of the end of the Middle Ages. But the changes weren't just in the fields, they were also in the mind. They were in the way people looked at the church. During the plague, people had prayed. They had filled the cathedrals. They had given all their money to the priests. And the priests had died, just like the sinners. God had remained silent. We are going to look at the crisis of faith. We will see how a new movement of extremists rose up, the flagellants. We will learn vocabulary for zealotry, persecution, and scapegoating. We will see how, when humans feel out of control, they often turn their fear into violence against their neighbors. The bodies have stopped falling, but the psychological scars are just beginning to open. The economy was changing, but the soul of Europe was breaking. Imagine you are a villager in Germany in 1349. You have survived, but your wife is dead. Your children are dead. Your priest is dead. You look up at the sky. It is blue and silent. You ask a simple question. Why? The church had a standard answer. This is God's punishment for your sins. If the plague is a punishment, then the logic follows that you must be punished to stop it. If you punish yourself enough, maybe God will stop killing everyone. Enter the flagellants. Flagellant comes from the Latin word for whip. In 1349, they appeared on the roads of Europe like a dark parade. They were not priests. They were ordinary people, merchants, peasants, knights, who had formed a radical movement. They marched from town to town in groups of 50 or 100. They wore white hoods with red crosses. When they entered a town, the bells rang. The townspeople gathered in awe. Awe is a feeling of reverential respect mixed with fear or wonder. The flagellants would form a circle in the market square. They would strip to the waist, and then they would beat themselves with leather whips tipped with iron spikes. They chanted hymns. They threw themselves on the ground. They bled into the dirt. They did this for 33 days, one day for each year of Jesus' life. To the modern eye, this looks like madness, but to the medieval eye, this looked like hope. They were trying to perform atonement. Atonement is the action of making amends for a wrong or injury. In a religious context, it means paying for your sins to get back in God's good graces. People cheered them. They dipped cloths in their blood, believing it was holy. The flagellants became more popular than the Pope. But here is the danger of zealotry. A zealot is a person who is fanatical and uncompromising in pursuit of their religious, political, or other ideals. When you believe you are the only one who can save the world, you start to despise the people who are different. The flagellants didn't just punish themselves. They began to look for the enemies of God. The emotional wave of our story turns from the pity of self-harm to the horror of murder. Since they could not see the bacteria, they looked for a human agent. They asked, "Who is poisoning us?" A rumor began to spread. It was a conspiracy theory. The rumor said, the Jewish communities are poisoning the wells. This was a lie, a complete fabrication. Fabrication is the action or process of manufacturing or inventing something, often a lie. Jewish people were dying of the plague just like the Christians. They drank the same water. They breathed the same air. But logic has no place in a panic. We call this scapegoating. A scapegoat is a person or group who is blamed for the wrongdoings, mistakes, or faults of others. The logic is simple and cruel. We are suffering. Someone must be to blame. It must be the outsiders. This led to horrific violence. In cities along the Rhine River, Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, the mobs attacked the Jewish quarters. The flagellants often led the charge, whipping the crowd into a frenzy. Frenzy is a state or period of uncontrolled excitement or wild behavior. They rounded up entire communities. In Strasbourg, thousands were burned alive on a wooden platform, even before the plague had fully arrived in the city. It was a preemptive massacre based on fear. Preemptive means serving or intended to forestall or prevent something, especially to prevent an attack by disabling the enemy. Historians read the chronicles of these events with heavy hearts. It shows how quickly human society can turn on its most vulnerable members when it is afraid. But there was one voice of reason. Surprisingly, it was the Pope. Pope Clement VI sat in his palace in Avignon. He watched the flagellants with suspicion. He saw that they were challenging the authority of the Church. If people could save themselves by whipping, they didn't need priests. But he also saw the injustice. He issued a bull. A papal bull is a formal proclamation issued by the Pope. In this document, he stated clearly that the Jews were not to blame. He pointed out that the plague was killing Jews, too. He pointed out that the plague existed in places where there were no Jews. He tried to use logic. It cannot be true that the Jews are the cause, since the plague touches them as well. He threatened to excommunicate the flagellants. To excommunicate means to officially exclude someone from participation in the sacraments and services of the Christian Church. It was the ultimate punishment. Slowly, the authorities regained control. They locked the gates against the flagellants. They suppressed the movement. The whipping stopped. The fires burned out. But the lesson remains. The siege of Caffa started with a dispute between cultures. The spread of the plague ended with a war between neighbors. The biology to society mirror shows us that when a pathogen attacks the body, paranoia attacks the mind. Paranoia is a mental condition characterized by delusions of persecution or grandeur. By 1351, the worst of the Black Death was over. The wave had passed. Europe was quiet. It was empty. It was traumatized. But it was also blank. A blank page is a tragedy, but it is also an opportunity. The survivors looked around. They saw the old structures lying in ruins. The old medicine had failed. The old prayers had failed. The old feudal laws had failed. So, what do you do when the old ways don't work? You invent new ones. We will see the birth of the Renaissance. We will see how the obsession with death led to a new obsession with life. We will look at art. We will see how the paintings changed from stiff, holy figures to realistic human skeletons, the danse macabre. And we will ask, did the Black Death actually cause the modernization of Europe? Evidence suggests it did. We are now in the late 1300s. The acute phase of the dying is over. But the culture of Europe has been permanently scarred. If you walk into a church painted in the 1350s or 1360s, you will notice a change in the art. Before the plague, art was often idealized. Saints were beautiful. Heaven was golden. After the plague, the art became obsessed with mortality. You start to see a new image everywhere. It is called the danse macabre, the dance of death. Imagine a painting on a church wall. It shows a long line of people holding hands. There is a pope, a king, a merchant, a peasant, a child. And in between each living person, there is a skeleton. The skeletons are dancing. They are smiling. They are leading the living towards the grave. The message was simple and brutal. Death is the great equalizer. The plague did not care if you were rich or poor. It did not care if you wore a crown or rags. Everyone danced the same dance in the end. This realization changed the mindset of the survivors. If death can come at any moment, why wait for the afterlife to be happy? Why save your money if you might be dead next week? A new philosophy began to emerge. It was a mix of fatalism and hedonism. People began to spend money on luxury goods. They bought silk, they bought spices, they commissioned art. This surge in spending helped jumpstart the economy. But something else was happening in the world of the mind. The authority of the ancients was cracking. For centuries, European universities had relied on the texts of ancient Greeks like Galen and Aristotle. If Galen said the body worked a certain way, it was true. You didn't check, you just read the book. But the doctors who followed Galen had failed to stop the plague. The status quo of knowledge had been proven useless. Survivors began to ask, maybe we should look for ourselves. Maybe we should dissect a body and see what's inside. This skepticism is the seed of the scientific revolution. Skepticism is a skeptical attitude, doubt as to the truth of something. In England, the language itself began to change. Before the plague, the official language of the court and the schools was French or Latin. But so many French-speaking teachers and priests died that there was a shortage of educators. Schools began to teach in English. Court proceedings began to be held in English. The language of the common people, the survivors, rose to prominence. Prominence means the state of being important or famous. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in the late 1300s. He wrote in English. And what is the Canterbury Tales about? It's about a group of pilgrims telling stories. It is bawdy, it is funny, it is human. It is not a stiff Latin text. It is the voice of a post-plague world that has decided to laugh in the face of death. Bawdy means dealing with sexual matters in a comical way, humorously indecent. The accidental twist here is that by killing the keepers of the old traditions, the Latin-speaking priests, the plague forced the culture to become more local, more vernacular, and more innovative. Vernacular refers to the language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people in a particular country or region. But we must not romanticize it too much. It was still a hard time. The plague did not go away after 1351. It returned. It came back in 1361, then 1369, then every 10 or 15 years for centuries. It became endemic. Europeans had to learn to live with the constant threat of extinction. This anxiety fueled the desire for technology. If labor is expensive, because everyone is dead, you need machines to do the work. We see improvements in water mills. We see the printing press arrive in the next century. Why write a book by hand if scribes are expensive and might die tomorrow? Build a machine to do it. The biology to society mirror shows us that a biological vacuum, lack of people, creates a technological pressure, need for machines. But let's go back to the source. Let's go back to Caffa. What happened to the city where it all began? While Europe was transforming, Caffa remained a trading post. The Genoese held on to it. They kept trading. But the secret was out. The world was connected. The siege of Caffa taught humanity a lesson that we are still learning today. In a globalized world, there is no such thing as over there. Over there is here. What happens in a market in China or a port in Crimea can change the life of a peasant in England within a few years. We are almost at the end of our investigation. We are going to summarize the legacy of the Black Death using 3 key English concepts: social mobility, secularism, and resilience. We will synthesize the evidence. Synthesize means to combine a number of things into a coherent whole. And we will prepare for our final verdict on the siege of Caffa. Was it biological warfare, or was it just nature doing its terrible work? The year is 1400. 50 years have passed since the ships left Caffa. If you looked at a map of Europe, the borders hadn't changed much. But if you looked into the eyes of the people, everything had changed. The Black Death was a forest fire. It burned down the old, rotting trees of the medieval world. But in the ashes, green shoots were growing. We call this regeneration. Regeneration is the action or process of regenerating or being regenerated. In particular, the formation of new animal or plant tissue. We are going to synthesize the 3 massive shifts that created the modern world. Shift number 1: social mobility. Before the plague, if you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. If you were born a lord, you died a lord. The ladder was broken. You could not climb. But the plague destroyed the workforce. As we learned, labor became valuable. Wealthy peasants began to buy land from impoverished lords. They started to dress like the nobility. They started to send their children to school. For the first time in history, a distinct middle class began to emerge. Social mobility is the ability of individuals or families to move up or down the social ladder. The rigid class system of the Middle Ages was not destroyed, but it was cracked, and through those cracks, people began to climb. Shift number 2: the rise of secularism. This is a complex word, but vital for advanced English. Secularism generally refers to the principle of separating the state from religious institutions. But in a cultural sense, it means a focus on the worldly life rather than the spiritual afterlife. Before 1347, the Church held absolute authority over the mind. They controlled the explanation of the universe. But during the plague, the Church had no answers. The priests died. The prayers failed. The survivors did not stop believing in God, but they stopped trusting the institution blindly. They began to focus on this life. They wanted to understand the laws of nature, not just the laws of Scripture. This shift paved the way for the Renaissance, the rebirth of art, science, and humanism. Humanism is a system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. Shift number 3: resilience. This is perhaps the most important word for us today. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. Toughness. The human species took a hit that should have ended civilization. We lost half our team. But we didn't fold. To fold, in this context, is a poker term meaning to give up or quit. Instead, we adapted. We invented quarantine laws. We improved sanitation, slowly. We developed new technologies to replace lost workers. The biology to society mirror reflects a hard truth here. Pressure creates diamonds. The extreme pressure of the plague forced society to become harder, sharper, and more efficient. But let's not forget the cost. The cost was silence. The cost was the millions of stories that were never told. because the storytellers died in the mud. As we approach the end of our documentary, we must return to the scene of the crime. We must go back to the walls of Caffa. We must look at Yanibeg one last time. We have explored the how, the rats, the ships, the fleas. We have explored the result, the collapse and rebirth of Europe. But we still have to answer the verdict on the initial accusation. Was it a war crime, or was it a myth? The story of the flying corpses is one of the most famous anecdotes in history. An anecdote is a short, amusing, or interesting story about a real incident or person. But as we have seen, anecdotes are not always data. We will deliver our final judgment. We will look at how modern science views the bioterror claim. And we will leave you with a final thought on how the ghosts of Caffa are still with us today, hiding in the cargo holds of our modern, globalized world. The journey is almost done. The ships are docking for the final time. We stand on the walls of Caffa one last time. The year is now today. The stone walls are crumbling. The city is now called Theodosia. Tourists walk where the Genoese sentries once stood. We have followed the ships. We have watched the rats. We have seen a civilization collapse and rebuild itself from the ashes. But we must answer the final question. Was the siege of Caffa the patient zero of biological warfare? Let's review the evidence. We have the testimony of Gabriele de Musi. He claims Yanibeg through mountains of dead bodies. But we know de Musi was in Italy, listening to rumors. We know the biology of Yersinia pestis. It prefers warm blood. Scientific consensus suggests that, while the Mongols might have thrown bodies to create a stench or fear, this action alone probably did not start the Black Death in Europe. Consensus means a general agreement. The rats were already moving. The trade routes were already open. The biological bomb was ticking long before the first catapult was fired. So, is the story of the flying corpses a lie? No, it is a myth. In history, a myth is not always a lie. It is a story that explains a complicated reality in a simple, symbolic way. The image of the flying corpse represents the moment human violence merged with natural disaster. It represents our fear that the enemy is not just fighting us, but infecting us. And that fear is still with us. Look at the world today. We do not have Genoese galleys. We have Boeing 747s. We do not have the Silk Road caravans. We have global supply chains. The incubation period of a virus on a ship was a few weeks. The incubation period on a plane is a few hours. We are closer to Caffa than we think. But we have something the Genoese did not have. We have the knowledge. We know what bacteria is. We understand transmission. We have the language of science. We have learned the lesson of the biology to society mirror. We know that a health crisis is never just about health. It is about economics, politics, and psychology. The siege of Caffa teaches us that we are all connected. Interconnected means that all parts are linked together. A sneeze in the east can cause a fever in the west. A decision by a Khan can change the wages of a peasant in England. The walls of Caffa could not keep the world out, and our modern borders cannot keep nature out either. So, as English learners and historians, what is our takeaway? Takeaway is a key fact, point, or idea to be remembered. typically one emerging from a discussion or lecture. Our takeaway is resilience. Humanity fell, but humanity stood up again. We built better ships. We built better laws. We built a new world. The silence of the steppe remains. The wind still blows over the Crimea, but the story of Caffa is not silent. It is a warning, and it is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Thank you for traveling with the London Gritty Chronicles. Keep reading, keep questioning, and keep learning.